For today's session, I'll be taking a cue from a line from Savitri. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. This is a line that occurs in Savitri in Book 10, Canto 4. It's line 623, and in my edition of the book, it is on page 658. Now, this line occurs at a point where the debate between the god of death and Savitri is over, and the god of death has gradually started becoming more and more aware of the special status of Savitri. She is not an ordinary human being. She has the power of the divine behind her, and she is on a mission. And he can see his defeat or the mission of Savitri both quite clearly, but still he has not given up, and he is continuing with his arguments, to which Savitri continues to reply in this canto also. And while replying to him, she is going into the deeper truths of existence, and this is one of the lines that she speaks while dwelling on the deepest truths of existence. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. I'll first try to sort of talk a little bit about this line itself before going further, and sort of put it in a proper perspective for those who may not have grasped its full significance. Of course, full significance is beyond me too, but maybe I can help in developing a little better mental understanding of this line. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. This in a way sums up the very origin and creation of the universe, and as a result, the all-pervasive presence of the divine. Now, if we go back to the times when nothing existed, this material universe as we see it did not exist, then for it to have come into being, there would be the necessity of a preceding cause, an entity which existed before the universe came into being, because logically speaking, only nothing can arise out of nothing. So if something has emerged, there must be something before it which was already there, which could give rise to it. But then that entity which gave rise to it, which gave rise to such a complex creation, such a vast creation, could not be something ordinary. And we may say that it would be an entity which knew everything and could do everything. Knowing and doing are two different aspects of the consciousness. Consciousness is awareness, knowledge, and the ability to do something, the ability to decide to do something and to execute it. So knowing and doing are both what are the two essential things in any consciousness. Now, this consciousness, which knew everything and could do everything, was therefore the supreme consciousness, the consciousness of the divine, or in simple terms, it was God. And it is that which gave rise to this material universe. But then, although this entity knew everything and could do everything, and one day decided to manifest in this material form, it had one major problem to solve, and that was it had no material available for doing so, because all what existed before was this consciousness, but in a non-material form. The material universe did not exist then. So for a material creation to come into being, some starting material is necessary. For example, if we have a carpenter and we want him to create a table, then we provide him some wood. So then the carpenter is the creator, wood is the material, and the table is the creation. Here the creator was there, it knew what it had to do, it wanted to create a material universe, but there was no material available. So in Vedanta, what we say is that this problem was solved by the creator itself becoming the creation. Since it could do everything, it could also become material. And that's what it did. So the material was nothing else but the creator itself in another form. It manifested as material, it became visible as material. But then just imagine what a great fall it was. The one who knew everything and could do everything became something that apparently knows nothing and can do nothing. So this was an act of gross self-limitation, act of self-denial, or what we may call gross involution, turning inwards, everything going within, very little showing outside. So this was an involution. However, the consciousness of the creator could not disappear. That got involved in this matter, and therefore it was there. But it was not visible, it was hidden, it was there in a dormant form, in a sleeping form. After this started the opposite process, the process of evolution, that is coming out. After going in, it started coming out, and that is what evolution was. So there was a progressive unfolding of the hidden consciousness. It started revealing itself bit by bit, in small steps, in small fractions of this hidden consciousness started manifesting. And the first major step in this direction was the appearance of life. So life manifested this hidden consciousness a little more than matter did. And then came creatures which also had a mind. So the creatures with a mind manifested this hidden consciousness still more. And the latest product of this evolution is the human being who manifests more of this hidden divinity, more of this hidden consciousness than any creature so far. But even man is only half animal and half divine, and is very far from fully manifesting that hidden consciousness of the divine. And therefore, if the trend in evolution is any indication so far, the process has not stopped with man, it is still continuing and will continue. However, there is a difference which we can expect, and that is because human being is the first creature on earth who has an urge to go beyond what is obvious, go beyond his present consciousness, to evolve during its own lifetime. It has a strong urge to know the deepest truths of existence, and it also has the capacity to do these things. So man has the first creature with this type of an aspiration, with an aspiration to know the divine and to manifest the divine, and it also has the capacity to do so. And therefore, since the evolution in any case is in the direction of greater manifestation, and man has the urge to do so, man can become a collaborator in the process of evolution. Man can collaborate in this process of evolution, and that is what the process of spiritual growth, the spiritual journey is all about. Now what I'll do is I'll give a little different direction, slightly out of context to this very line. In finite things the conscious infinite dwells. Now since everything that is visible, be it matter, be it creatures with life, or be it the human beings, they are all different forms of the same divine which became visible in this form. It follows as a corollary that the divine is present in all these forms, because it is nothing but the divine in another form. For example, suppose a child starts with a square piece of paper, folds it and makes a boat out of it. And we ask, does the boat have paper? The child will say, obviously, because the paper itself has become the boat. So in the same way, the creator itself became the creation, and therefore naturally the creator is there in every bit of the creation. Now the creation is finite, that is, it has a limited existence, limited in both time and space. It occupies a measurable space, and it exists in this form for a limited period of time. So that way it is finite. But the one that created all this is infinite. It is not bound by time and space. Even when it became the material universe, which is finite, that did not exhaust it. It continues to exist also beyond the universe in an invisible form. So that is the infinite, which is not measurable, not confined to space, not limited in terms of time. It has always been there and it will always be there. So that is what is meant by this. In finite things, that is measurable and visible things, the conscious infinite dwells, it lives in the finite things. The conscious, that is the one which has the total consciousness, that infinite, without any limitations, without any boundary, dwells, it lives there. Which means that although the visible manifestation has so many forms, matter, plants, animals, human beings, all these have something in common. What is common in them is that they all have the presence of the divine within. They all have the same potential consciousness, and only a small fraction is visible, but it is all there within. Now, if that is so, then it should be possible also to have some sort of a communication between these different forms. Because for communication, language is only a limited means, and the way human beings speak, no other creature does. But then it has been found that even human beings communicate more in a non-verbal manner than through words. So what we speak communicates only a small part of what we want to say, and the non-verbal communication, that is the tone of the voice, the expression on the face, the body language, all these speak more than what the words do. But leaving that aside, because of this consciousness which exists in everything that is manifest, and because there is no breach of continuity between one form of manifestation and another, which means that the boundary of you and me, the boundary of a tree or the boundary of an animal, now which is defined by their material body, is only a partial reality. The deeper reality is the consciousness that dwells in all these, and that consciousness is the consciousness of the Supreme, and the presence of this Supreme consciousness everywhere is what we call the Spirit. We call it the Spirit because the Spirit is something that is fundamental, although not visible. For example, when we say that the spirit of the painter is there in her painting, what we mean is that although what we see is only a painting, some aspect of the personality of the painter has got into it. So in the same way, although we see a person or an animal or a plant, an essential aspect of the creator of these things has got into all these, and that is the Spirit. So there's an all-pervasive spirit of the divine throughout the creation, and in that there's no breach of continuity. The boundaries defined by our material bodies are only a partial reality. These bodies can be considered a condensation of that spirit, a condensed form which has taken a very visible shape. But between these, say there is an air gap. Now that air is also material. It is a different type of matter. It is gases. We don't see it, but then that air also is a manifestation of the same. So there are condensed bits, which is one modality of expression, and there are these invisible forms like air, which are another form of the same manifesting in a different way. But there's no breach of continuity. There's a sense of there's no real boundary between us, and therefore it should be possible to communicate. And therefore, this type of a communication is, from the spiritual point of view, rational, and it should happen. It should be possible. Does it actually happen? Now, you might have seen that if you have grown plants, you can send your love to the plants. The feelings with which you handle the plant affects the way the plant grows. The faster it grows, it looks healthy. You can see the plant also happy and smiling if you treat it well. If you neglect it for a long time, don't give it water or anything, then the plant seems to be disappointed, the plant is not happy, and so on. In the case of pets, animals like dogs and cats, we can see it even more clearly because they have a consciousness which is which has a much greater similarity to ours than the consciousness of the plant. We can see it even more. And without saying any words, you can communicate a lot to your pet, and the pet can communicate it to you. But then the creature doesn't necessarily have to be a pet. Even those who are not our pets, if you have that same type of attitude, you'll find that you'll be able to communicate with them. And say, in the ashram there are so many peacocks, and gradually they got used to all of us, and they're not at all afraid. So there is some sort of communication that has taken place, and therefore if you walk very near them, they don't run away. Not only that, if you look at them and with love, and maybe say even in your own language, wish them, they seem to wish back instead of running away. So there is a communication that you can feel even with the peacocks. But the story that I'm going to tell you is even more weird than talking to a peacock. And this story comes from an animal lover and a writer, Allen Boone, an American writer, who had this type of silent communication with a wide variety of animals. And in this story, he talks about his communication with, imagine what animal? A housefly. A housefly. And the encounter begins something like this, that one day he was shaving in the bathroom, and in front of him was a magnifying mirror, a mirror which makes the face look bigger so that you can see your hair on the beard and all that more clearly and do a better job of shaving. So he had this magnifying mirror in front of him, and on this mirror came and sat a housefly. And he started wondering why of all the places it has chosen this mirror to sit. And he started imagining that maybe it is enjoying its magnified look in the mirror, this type of a self-aggrandizement, self-exaggeration. It's also enjoying the way human beings do. And it thinks that I am an audience that is appreciating her magnified look. So after doing that, he came out and was sitting at the breakfast table. And then he found a fly sitting at the edge of the plate in which he was going to eat. And he started wondering, normally there are no flies in the house. How is it there are two flies? One I saw in the bathroom, and now one is on the plate. Anyway, so far so good. Then he went to the room where he used to do his writing work, and he found that at the writing desk there was a pile of paper, yellow typing paper as he says, and a fly was sitting on the edge of one of those piles of paper, yellow typing paper. So he says, a third fly, and then he started, is it really three flies or just one who comes everywhere? So he went and checked at the breakfast table, he went and checked in the bathroom, no fly there, and he thought possibly it's the same fly which is following me wherever I go. So then he came back again to the same place, doing his writing work, no fly there either. But then within 2 minutes appeared a fly once more, and as he describes, it seemed to be coming like a tiny plane which is back from its mission. And then he thought that probably it is feeling lonely and is looking for human company, and that is why it is here. So it came like a plane, made a few circles around his head, and then went and landed exactly on the same pile of paper. So now he thought that since it seems to be lonely and is following me everywhere, let me try to give it some company. And he started looking at that fly with a great deal of love. And after looking at it and imagining that now it has also noticed this communication, he put his forefinger at the edge of the paper a short distance away from the fly. The fly didn't fly away. And then this person started telling the fly, you can come and sit on my finger. And then what happened? I'll read out a bit because he's written it in such a beautiful way that I'll not be able to duplicate that. Then I cautiously placed a forefinger on the edge of the pile of yellow paper and, with all the friendliness I could put into it, asked him if he would not like to come aboard so we could get to know each other better. So come and sit on my finger. No. In a movement too swift for the eyes to follow, he was off the paper and on my finger. It came. I lifted the finger to eye level and began watching him through a magnifying glass. For a few minutes, he was very quiet. Perhaps he was planning what to do next. Then, with the quick step so characteristic of flies, he began parading up and down the full length of my finger as if it were marching to the music of an invisible brass band. Now and then, he would pause and then resume his parading. He gave the impression that he was having a perfectly wonderful time and hoped I was too. In the midst of all the swift bodily movements, he stopped abruptly, swung completely around, marched to the middle of the finger, and began rubbing his legs over the head. Flies do that quite often, causing it to bob briskly up and down. The head started bobbing up and down in my direction. Assuming that this could be his way of expressing appreciation and not to be outdone in good manners in my own house, especially by a fly, I began bowing just as politely back to him. I was grateful that none of the neighbors could see me through the windows. Curious as to what his reactions might be, I abruptly tossed the little finger into the air. It did not disturb him in the least. In fact, he seemed to like it. He cruised slowly about just above my head, but when I pointed my finger up in his direction, down he came, landing on the fingertip as though he and I had been doing such things for a long time. I did this again and again, but every time he was tossed off, he would always return to the extended finger and resume his parading, posturing, and head bobbing. As we paused after one of those landings, I slowly reached over another finger and touched him. He skidded a little with the extreme gentleness of the touch, but he did not take off, nor did he show the least sign of fear. I began slowly stroking the edges of his wings and silently talking across to him. Not as to a fly with all the limiting and condemning things that we humans usually fasten on flies, but as to an intelligent fellow being. So, the attitude matters. He was not treating him with the sort of contempt with which human beings generally treat flies, but was just treating it as a fellow being. While the world all about us was deeply bogged in misunderstanding, fear, and destruction, all was exceedingly well between that little housefly and me, at least for the time being. So, if we look around in the world, we find so much of disorder and chaos all the time, this happening in Ukraine and this happening there and that. So he says, in the world all about us deeply bogged in misunderstanding, fear, and destruction, all was exceedingly well between the little housefly and me, at least for the time being. A few days after getting to know him, I gave him the name Freddy the Fly. I know he approved of it because he always responded to the name whenever I called him, regardless of whether I did so mentally or vocally. We turned out ourselves into a couple of experimental guinea pigs, so to speak, to see how far we could go in really understanding each other as fellow beings. So now they reached a level where the fly would respond to its name and come whenever he wanted. So he goes on. Another factor that was helpful in getting us past the blockages that have prevented humans and flies from really understanding each other was this motto: if you would learn the secret of right relations, look only for the good, that is the divine, in people and things, and leave all the rest to God. A very important lesson, a general lesson that if you want to establish a good relationship with anyone, then look for only good things in that person, nothing bad, and try to see the divine in that person. Then naturally you'll see only the good, and leave the rest, that is the rest of the manifestation in that person which you may not like, to God. It's not your business to assess, evaluate, criticize, condemn, and so on and so forth. So if you would learn the secret of right relations, look only for the good, that is the divine, in people and things, and leave all the rest to God. Using this old precept was like waving a magic wand in all my dealings with Freddy. It transformed him into something that looked like a fly, but certainly did not act like one in its companionship with me. Through the constant effort to look only for the good, Freddy became something like a character out of the pages of Hans Christian Andersen, story writer. Then he goes on, after a little few lines, wherever I went in the house, Freddy would come along too and share the best we could in the activity, often riding on one of my shoulders, sometimes flying ahead of me doing acrobatics. If I were in a hurry and raced through the rooms, he would always shoot ahead and show me how little accomplished I really was in speed and agility. If I suddenly stopped, he would usually make a few observation loops and return to my shoulder. So he would be sitting on his shoulder, sometimes flying ahead of him to show him that I can outdo you when it comes to speed and agility. And if this person would suddenly stop, he would just make a few observation loops and then land on his shoulder. If there was something that I wanted to listen to on the radio, Freddy would stand on top of the instrument and seem to be listening too. If things had to be taken out of a bookcase or filing cabinet, he would supervise the job from some nearby point of vantage. While I was writing, he would spend his time either cruising about nearby or snooping around on the desk. While Freddy had permission to do whatever he pleased, there was one social amenity that I insisted he must observe. He must not walk around on my face, hands, or other exposed skin surfaces, except, of course, perhaps the finger when he lets him do it. I certainly explained to him that such walking on the human epidermis had a tendency to provoke the members of my species to violent moods and actions. So that is the weakness of my species. If you walk on the skin, then they can turn violent and that spoils their mood. He must have understood me, because not once during the time he lived with me did he violate this rule. He would walk all over my clothes, which had been declared open territory, and he would walk along the rim of my collar and the edges of my sleeves, but not once did any of his feet touch my skin without permission. Here was real social cooperation from a common little housefly, who had never had any kind of schooling, who could neither read nor write, who could not ask questions, who had never gone anywhere or seen how the rest of the world lives, and who had no Emily Post to recommend behavior pattern for him. Emily Post, was an American writer. She was born rich, and in childhood it said that she was a spoilt girl. But then at the age of 50, this spoilt girl ended up writing a classic on what good manners are about, and which she had, it was a book out of sort of the ordinary. It's not just telling that this is right and this is wrong, this is good manners and this is bad manners. It was in the form of little stories in which there were characters, well-behaved, not so well-behaved, and so on, and the children could easily relate to that. So she became the writer of one of the most important book on good manners at the age of 50. But he did not need any such human props. His was an innate ability to know, to be, and to share. That some of the characteristics of that divine consciousness were present in that hidden form, and they just had to be brought out through this type of a loving relationship. Now comes the finale to this. Although he probably didn't talk too much about this relationship with this fly, but somehow the word got out, and more and more people came to know. And the result was what he describes next. Late one night, after I had been in bed for several hours, there was a vigorous banging on the front door as though a police squad had arrived. It turned out to be an actor friend, and he was erupting with excitement and curiosity. He had heard about Freddy the Fly at a dinner party which he had just left. He was greatly interested in the reports, but he was not willing to believe them without personal verification. So at night came one of his friends who wanted to verify personally, is he really as friendly with the fly as he claims to be? And does the fly really respond to its name and come? I told him it would be impossible for him to meet Freddy at that hour because it was late at night. as I did not know where the little fellow spent the time between sunset and sunrise. So all this interaction was in the daytime, not at night. He didn't know where the fly slept. I suggested that he return the following day when I could guarantee Freddy's appearance. But that was impossible. The actor was leaving for a trip to New York the following morning. He begged and pleaded for just one look at Freddy. Finally, much against my better judgment, I agreed to try to produce him. The actor found a comfortable spot in the middle of a large couch where he could command a full sweep of the room. I sat in a chair, the arm of which was one of Freddy's favorite spots. My friend began staring at me in the same way that people used to stare at the great magician Houdini. I sat very still and without the least outward hint as to what I was really doing, began sending out silent emergency calls for Freddy. So without speaking out, silently started calling Freddy as if it was an emergency and he wanted him. We waited and waited and waited, but no Freddy, no signs of the fly turning up. Considering the high tension nature of the actor, he was unbelievably patient. Nevertheless, the atmosphere of disbelief was beginning to ooze from him. I kept the silent calls going. So the actor was now feeling, yes, I didn't believe it, and see, he can't produce the fly. Much more time elapsed and nothing happened. Then just as I was about to call the whole thing off, a spark of highly animated life came speeding out of the darkness of the bedroom. It was Freddy. He began flying slow circles just above my eye level. Is that really Freddy? The actor gasped. For a number of minutes, we both watched the little fly as he cruised slowly about, waiting to see what the plans were. Then I pointed a forefinger in his direction. Down he came, landing daintily and gracefully on the tip of the finger. The expression on the actor's face was one I am sure he had never registered before. For a while, I talked vocally across to Freddy, thanking him for coming, explaining the entire situation to him, and then, as a fitting climax, introducing him to the actor. This incredible tale forms a part of this book, Whispers of Nature. And this is a book published by Sri Aurobindo Society in Pondicherry, wherein you find a large number of such stories and incidents, starting with studies on dead matter and going up to higher animals like tigers and horses and so on, trying to sort of show how you can find the presence of that consciousness of the divine in all these. For example, in dead matter, there are some experiments of Jagdish Chandra Bose that he has talked about that are there in this book, where he was experimenting with the way the resistance, say, in some conducting materials behaves, and you find that if you test it repeatedly, then gradually the curve of the resistance that keeps changing and keeps coming down. So there's a change which is very similar to the type of fatigue that takes place in muscles. So the metals also show signs of fatigue the way the human muscles do, and so on and so forth. So there are many things which come out in this, which bring out this hidden consciousness in everything, which makes these things, even dead matter, show some characteristics of characteristics which can be attributed to that consciousness. And in case of at least animals and plants, also show that it is possible to for human beings to communicate. There are many experiments of this type done also in the field of medicine now, and they are trying to sort of see whether apart from the person's own mind-body relationship, that if he thinks positively, he gets healthier, and if he falls ill, he's more likely to recover faster. Apart from this, is it possible for the healer or the doctor to send those messages, those silent vibrations, those intentions, those prayers, which will make the patient improve faster? And for that, actually, it's not necessary to be a doctor or a healer. Any well-wisher can do that. So there are experiments along these lines, and that again is based on the same sort of spiritual sort of truth, that my body and mind and your body and mind are actually manifestations of the same consciousness, and the air gap separating us is also a manifestation of the same, and therefore there's no real breach of continuity. Any one mode of consciousness can influence another mode of consciousness. So the healer's or the well-wisher's mind is a subtle mode of consciousness, subtle mode of manifestation of the same consciousness, and the patient's body is a gross manifestation of the same supreme consciousness. And there is no gap between the two, and therefore they should be able to, this communication should be possible, and one person's mind should be able to influence another person's body. But there are doubts expressed that if a person knows that this doctor is praying for me or this well-wisher is praying for me, then this person feels that I'll get better. So actually it's the person's own mind-body relationship which is at work. So therefore in this case, the experiments down the evolutionary scale, like this one, this story that we talked about, become more meaningful, which means that communication is possible even when we assume that there is no real mind at work. But then in case of animals, even a fly, one may think, well, there's some sort of a rudimentary mind maybe. So experiments have been done not only on plants, but also on tiny microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. So you can grow them in the laboratory and you can monitor the rate at which they grow. So if there are two sets of, say, culture plates in which germs are growing, for one of these, somebody is praying that they should grow faster or slower. For the other group, nothing is being done. You find that the one for which these intentions are being sent actually seem to respond. Now, if it is possible in a culture plate, maybe it's also possible in a human being. Somebody has an infection, you do the same, and the person's germs should multiply slower and help the person's immune system deal with those germs. You go further down the evolutionary scale, there are studies on cell cultures. Just isolated cells, not full organisms. Microorganism is at least a full organism, just cell cultures. Say cancer cells in a culture, in a test tube. And you can do the same, you can send your intentions there. In one case, in another set of tubes you don't do it. Those in which you do, you find that the cells multiply slower. You go further down the evolutionary scale, take two chemicals which react with each other in a test tube. Enzyme and substrate. Enzymes can increase or decrease the rate of a chemical reaction. Usually they increase it, so we call them catalysts. They increase the rate of a chemical reaction. So enzyme is the one which increases the rate, and substrate is the substance with which it interacts chemically. So you have the substrate and the enzyme in a test tube, two sets of test tubes. In one case, you send these intentions of increasing or decreasing the rate of the chemical reaction. In another case, you do nothing. The one in which you do it, you find that you get a positive result. It does happen. You go to non-living systems like a computer, and the computer is generating random numbers. You try to influence that through this mental wishing, willing, or intending, and you find that the computer, the generation of random numbers responds. Now all what this is showing is that the unified field of consciousness in which any mode of manifestation can interact with any other mode of manifestation, if we are able to go deep within and access the deepest part of ourselves, which then perhaps gets in touch with the deepest part of this in some other mode of manifestation, and you are able to influence what is actually happening in another system, be it a living system or be it even sometimes a non-living system. So we come back to the line with which we started, and you find the evidence of it in all these observations. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. This book is Whispers of Nature, because its nature is this hidden consciousness, as you can call nature, and it doesn't shout loudly to show that we have a relationship, we are interrelated, and we talk to each other openly and loudly in the type of language which we as human beings use. But all the same, there are these faint whispers of communication which you can detect indirectly through all these phenomena which we can observe, and that's why the book is Whispers of Nature. Any quick questions or comments? Yes, the question is that one can understand that this type of a communication is possible. What is it that prevents us from this communication? Basically, our preconceived notions. We feel it is not possible, and therefore that thought process itself becomes an obstruction. Yes, this book has only true stories, and coming from a well-known writer and finding a place in a book published by Sri Aurobindo Society, I would say that yes, these are all true stories. Yes, so the question is about worshipping, say, hills and plants and trees and rivers and so on. So, nature worship. The question is about nature worship. Yes, I mean, this Vedantic truth has found an expression in many aspects of our life, particularly things like worshipping nature and even idol worship. If you can see the divine in a murti, in an idol, then yes, the divine is actually there, and it's just a question of being able to see in it, and you can then communicate with a picture or an idol. Yes, that's a good comment, that we, through our own mind, particularly our intellect, create those obstacles. And as we rise in consciousness, those obstacles tend to disappear. So if we change, we work on ourselves, we grow spiritually, our consciousness expands, then this communication becomes easier.